Hello, friends, and welcome or welcome back to my commonplace journal. This is a place where we are going to be exploring strange history, spooky tales, and do a little bit of creative journaling together. So, if this sounds interesting to you, hang out. Not a super long video, but I think you'll find it very fun and hopefully informative. So, today I'm going to document one of my favorite unsettling historical figures. This is the Plague Doctor. But before we dive in, for anyone new here, I want to just kind of explain commonplacing itself and then what it means to me. So, commonplacing is usually like some type of a personal archive, space where you can gather quotes, notes, historical facts, some interesting images, or just about anything that sparks your curiosity. So, it's kind of like part research journal, part creative outlet, and there's really no one way to do it. Some people use theirs for philosophy, recipes, sketches. Mine tend to lead more heavily towards strange, historical, and like beautifully macabre. So, here, what we're going to do is kind of walk through the setup of the journal and the story behind the Plague Doctor. So, for today's pages, I'm using a few of my favorite journaling things. That's one of them right there. That is my Coffee Monsters Co. SD fountain pen. And the ink that I'm using for this particular one is the Kaweco Caramel Brown. I love, love, love this. It is a very nice, deep, kind of chocolate brown color, and I thought it went really well with all these black and white photos. The other thing that we're using here is my commonplace journal, which is the cloth and paper. It's one of the ones that came in last month's, nope, the month before. I want to say May. This was in the May intentions box. So this is the one I went with. There were a couple different choices in that particular box, but I went with this one because I really, really like kind of the blankness of each page, giving me just like an open, do whatever I want with each page. So we have that. Then we also have for the illustrations. So all of these pictures that you see in here, some of them I had my son do for me. Some of them were just historical pictures that I pulled off of the internet, and then I printed them on sticker paper and then cut them down to size for this. Some of them are things that I did myself, that I designed, like the words. You'll see some quotes in here. You'll see the Ring Around the Rosie poem in here. Like all of those things I put on washi paper so that I could overlay them over the photos. And some of my absolute favorite things about journaling like this is how tactile it is. So we live in a very digital world, and a lot of the information that I gained for this is obviously from the digital world. I watched movies, I've done some research on like YouTube videos, historical videos. There's Marvelous History, that those kinds of places that I gained all of my information for this particular commonplace spread. But also, it's the pens, the paper, the layering. It's almost like meditative when you just sit down with all of these things and just start writing. It's really, really, really fun for me. I really enjoy it. So today's entry actually talks about just the plague doctor, not the plague from the 17th century. We already know all we need to know about the plague, how it was transmitted, basically a death sentence for most people who contracted it. But I wanted to talk about the plague doctor. That's who interests me. Who were these people? Why did they take their lives into their hands going into what is considered to be a death sentence? There's a lot of mystery surrounding these people and who they really were, whereas actually most of them weren't even real physicians. As time went by and it became abundantly clear that your chances of survival were less and less, you would end up with more like mercenaries or people who really didn't have any medical skill at all, actually going into these plague ridden areas. And it was more for like documenting deaths, even sometimes carrying out autopsies so that they could try to better learn. There was just a lot of history. So I thought what I would do is start by telling you the story, like giving you like just kind of a background of what it must have been like in order to be in the 17th century when this stuff was happening. So let's start with the story. Echoes of the Plague Doctor. There's a silhouette that haunts the pages of history, a black cloaked figure with a curved beak and glassy soulless eyes. To some, it brought healing. To others, it brought death. In plague-ridden cities of 17th century Europe, this spectral form was known simply as the Plague Doctor, a physician cloaked in leather, moving like death itself through alleys thick with rot and silence. Imagine it, A street once bustling with laughter now lies silent, broken only by the distant tolling of a bell. Smoke drifts from burning piles of bedding and bodies, and then you see it. Emerging from the fog, a tall figure draped in black, face hidden beneath a bird like mask. A crooked wooden cane taps against the cobblestone as the figure approaches, its breath audible beneath the mask. Two holes at the end of a long, curved bird like mask. The eyes, glass, expressionless, glow faintly in the lantern light. You've heard of him, of course, everyone has. The Crow Man, they call him, the Black Doctor, the Collector. To see him at your neighbor's door is a death sentence. To see him at yours, it's too late. So let's dive into who the plague doctors actually were. So, most often, they were the only ones willing to face the disease. They treated victims with things like poultices, lanced those buboles, I think that's what they called them, administered concoctions like vinegar, and they did some bloodletting, kept daily records of the dead. Their duties were more bureaucratic than medical because they needed to tally fatalities, write death certificates, and witness wills. A lot of times, people in these plague ridden areas were completely segregated away from the healthy individuals. So they may not have anybody to witness their last will and testament. So a lot of times the plague doctors were there to do that for them, knowing that they were not going to survive. So, but despite their grim task, many plague doctors were actually not highly trained. Some were volunteers, others mercenaries. They were drawn by hazard pay, and a few genuinely sought to heal, but most knew they were working against time. So, for this part of the journal, I decided to focus on the fear and the folklore that surrounds the plague doctor. So, one of the things that arose during this time is this children's nursery rhyme that has to do with the plague or is thought to have to do with the plague. Now, there's some question about when this actually was written and if it actually really did have to do with the plague, but according to Shakespeare, it was part of that time period, and it was something that was sung by children. So the ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The ring around the rosy part has to do, what is thought has to do with the rings that occurred on the plague victims around the boils that they had on their skin when they had contracted the plague. Then the pocket full of posies had to do with the smell. So plague doctors would stuff the beak, which we'll talk about later, would stuff the beak with different things that would quote unquote stop the bad air, which was one of the miasmas. Um, but also people would walk around with flowers or other things, ruse, whatever they had at the time to try to mask the smell. Then ashes and ashes, that probably has reference to all the burning. There was constant smoke in the city, constant burning in these plague areas of anything that a plague victim touched was burned. Didn't matter if it was an entire household of stuff, because sometimes it was the entire household that actually died. All of their things were brought out and burned. So that probably has to do with the ashes and ashes. And then we all fall down has to do with the fatalistic reference of the plague's high mortality rate. That was pretty much obvious that if you got the plague, there was very little chance you were going to survive. So with that being said, I thought I would do a little bit of the reading of what I'm writing down right now to you so that you can get. I do have an account from somebody who was there at that time, supposedly, and what he wrote in his diary, and then some other things about the children of the time and the stories that were told. So I'll just read to you what I'm going to start writing down here in just a second. So, despite their purpose, the very presence of a plague doctor inspired dread. Their bird like masks and corpse like gait became symbols of the end. Now, I did look into the corpse like gait reference because I thought, well, is it because of what they're wearing, because of the outfit that they're wearing, which we will go over in just a minute. On the next set of pages, I actually have a thing where I went through the whole entire outfit and what each piece meant. But I believe that the reason why this was mentioned so much in historical accounts during this time was just fear. They were scared. If you saw a plague doctor coming down the street, you had all kinds of things running through your head. And I believe that the corpse like gait was just something that was written down, but they didn't actually have like a different kind of a walk. I think they walked like normal. They did have a cane that tapped on the ground, so maybe just like the whole appearance of them caused so much fear that they just manifested that into their writing. I'm not sure. But in his diary, Samuel wrote, I can't say his last name, so I'm not even going to try. Great fears of the sickness here in the city. It being said that 2 or 3 houses are already shut up. These homes bore red crosses painted on the doors and the plea, Lord, have mercy upon us. When the doctor came, it meant quarantine and death. Over time, myth grew. People whispered that plague doctors were not healers, but agents of death. Some claimed that they summoned death, others that they dabbled in black alchemy, seeking to master disease itself. Children were told tales of the Black Crow, who snuck into homes and stole the souls of the sick. In Venice, even to this day, ghost stories still speak of beaked figures watching from bridges and then vanishing into the fog. Whether hallucinations, echoes of trauma, or something more, who knows? So, for this part of my journal, I really wanted to dive into the actual plague doctor costume. So, I don't really feel like the plague doctor would be such a prominent figure in history without the full getup, from the mask to the oiled cloak to the cane, the whole thing. Just really elevated this particular character in this particular time in history to become so prominent during today. So, from video games to movies, it has all kinds of different connotations. But where it started out was early plague doctors did not have any type of protection whatsoever. Prior to 1619, with Charles de Lomé started created this actual outfit. Plague doctors weren't plague doctors. They were just doctors or barbers or anybody in the community that was felt the need to help out and would go into these areas and actually tend to the sick without having any type of protection whatsoever, which was obviously a death sentence for all of them. So this costume really came about out of fear, like a combination of superstition, science, and fear. But the purpose was pretty simple, and it was obviously for survival. So let's dive into the costume itself. So this is an actual picture that I pulled off of the internet, and it is in a museum where there's actually a couple of, not complete, they're 100% not complete, but these are early plague doctor costumes. And what was thought to protect actually more than likely spread the disease faster, caused themselves to die quicker. I mean, to be fair, they had the best intentions, but at the same time, a lot of times these costumes were not well taken care of. And I say costume because it had zero protection whatsoever for the person that was wearing it or the subsequent people that they sought to help while wearing it. So in today's time, we had something similar happen during the actual COVID outbreak. So when the COVID outbreak first started, I'm just going to use this as an example because it's the only thing that I have a reference to because I'm a respiratory therapist and I did work in the COVID unit right when that hit. Um, we had no idea. Like we didn't know what spread it, how fast it went. There was all kinds of myths, and it was very very interesting to be in the middle of that whole entire process and to see the thought process of the doctors and the caregivers and the respiratory therapists and should we do this or should we do that or what's the best way to take care of this and that. And I can imagine that being in this particular time during the plague in the 17th century with the limited amount of knowledge. I say in our time, we still have a very limited amount of knowledge when it comes to disease and treatment and the brain and all that kind of stuff. But can you imagine in the 17th century what they actually were trying to figure out with the amount of knowledge that they had at that time is absolutely mind boggling to me. So the idea between the with the beaked mask, let's start with the mask, was it's a hollow bird's beak stuffed with strong smelling herbs like lavender and rue, mink cloves, and this was supposed to ward off the miasma or poisoned air that was thought to carry the plague. We know that it was not carried that way. We now know how the plague was spread, but at the time, I'm sure that they had absolutely no idea, and there was a lot of fear that went around the creation of this whole entire costume. So they had a wide brimmed hat, which was just a signal of a doctor. That's all. It was just so that people who saw them coming knew that that person that was coming towards them was a doctor. It really didn't have any significance as far as protection was concerned. It was just like a sign or a signal that that person was a doctor. Although we already know now that they really weren't. But the overcoat and the gloves and the boots were made of leather often, and they were treated with oils or wax in the thought to kind of repel moisture and infected body fluids. The eyes. This is interesting because I don't know how they saw where they were going. Maybe that's where the weird gate came from because they couldn't see where the hell they were going. So the eyes were glass lenses and they sealed the eyes from deadly vapors, and but it also gave like the doctors a ghostly unblinking stare, which is where that part of what I read earlier came from. The wooden cane, which was used to examine patients without touching them, to lift clothing, or to fend off the desperate. I'm assuming that people who saw plague doctors coming knew it was the end and they were pretty desperate and they may be clutching or, trying to grab at the doctors, thinking that they could somehow help their family members faster if they grabbed them. I don't know. But anyway, the person that came up with this costume, Charles Delorme, that's the only way I know how to say his name, described this macabre suit as he himself made a leather suit which bad air penetrates with great difficulty. He put garlic and rue in his mouth. He put incense in his nose and ears, covered his eyes with spectacles, and in this equipment assisted the sick. So that's from Charles Delorme himself, what he wrote about his own costume. So this is what I love about commonplacing. Entries like this remind me why I love this so, so, so very much. So the Plague Doctor isn't just a spooky, it's also a window into how people faced fear and death in the limited knowledge that they had at the time. By studying the bizarre, we understand not just the past, but how far we've come. This is why my commonplacing book includes not only text, but diagrams and ephemera and artworks and doodles and all the things that I needed in order to record this information. And it's not just about capturing people's sentiments and these pictures, but it's also capturing the feeling that I got during this history lesson. So I'm going to finish this off with the legacy that I wrote down. This is how I'm going to end this whole entire segment. So, dress like death and fighting for life. The Plague Doctor remains one of history's most chilling paradoxes, a figure of healing dressed like horror. Their methods were flawed, their understanding limited, but their courage often very real. They were both feared and needed, villains in lore and heroes in silence. They stood between the living and the dead when others turned away. In their hollow eyes, we glimpse the past and perhaps our own fears in times of plague and uncertainty. And then I end it with putting the word alone, because that is probably very much like what being a plague doctor was. You were going to be very alone. People were going to be afraid of you, and people were not going to want to participate in the things that you were obviously doing. So I imagine that being surrounded by all of that death and dismay and horror was probably a very alone time. So with that, our Plague Doctor entry is complete. But the spooky history does not have to end here. Next up, I'm going to be doing a spread on one of that's a hard word, literature's most iconic creations, and that is the history of Dr. Frankenstein. So I'm going to go from Mary Shelley's haunting novel to the birth of the Universal Studios classic monster, and I will dive into the origins of one of horror's most endearing legends. So I really, really hope that you enjoyed this little deep dive into history and into my little journal here. Be sure to subscribe, follow, join me as we continue to fill these pages, and until next time, happy commonplacing.